Okay, this is our Sunday school program, a great program just called Sunday School Stories. These are, as I understand them, stories of, as I read in the bulletin, discerning and responding to your call from God. And when Audra asked me and Dr. John asked me to do this, I said, sure, that's no problem. Seems like I've been doing this a lot lately, talking about discernment and responding to God's call. And one of the things that I had done several times, especially lately, is write what they call a spiritual autobiography. I did this about, this is a copy of one version, I will say. I did this about, I don't know, when Tom's first year, I think, with us, we did it for a Wednesday night program, and I wrote one that time. I highly recommend it if you're trying to understand God's call for you, because the more I think about it, by looking at my past, it really gave me a better feel for how God was working in my life, even at times when I didn't realize He was working in my life. But when you start to look at your past, then you can kind of put together a series of events that lead you to where you are today. So it's a wonderful exercise. If you've never sat down and just written out, your spiritual autobiography, I recommend it. I did it once for Tom and presented it on a Wednesday night. The second time I did it was for our Education for Ministry class. We had to work on a spiritual autobiography a couple of years ago, and we add to it every year in that class. And the third time was for the discernment process, when I felt a call to ordained ministry. And part of that process is one of the very first things you do is you sit down and you write a spiritual autobiography. You present that to your priest. It goes to the vestry, it goes to the bishop, it goes to a lot of people. And the hardest part about this one is I had to cut mine from 10 pages back down to 5 for them. So I have no idea how long this is going to take. So if somebody will let me know when it gets to about 30 minutes, I do want to leave time for questions if there's questions. But one of the biggest parts is, and I don't think you can understand, I guess, my call to ordained ministry for certain without looking at the whole history that led up to it, because it wasn't just one moment that said, this is when you should do this. It was, as I said, 100 little steps that kind of lead to the next step. And there were several times I did feel like God spoke directly to me and said, John, this is what you need to be doing. It wasn't the actual voice, but when God moves you, you know that God moves you if you've had that experience. So let me go back and do a little bit of the background, just so you'll have an idea of at least what my perspective was growing up. I grew up here in Kinston. I think probably the most significant thing in my autobiography is that my parents did not attend church. My mom comes with me here now, but when I was growing up, we did not attend any church at all. So this was a very different situation than when Tom gave his a couple of weeks ago. He'd always known church. He'd always known God. That was not the case for me. I think my parents said something to the effect of, we just never got reestablished. It wasn't that they didn't believe in God or they were anti-God, although my dad was a scientist. I really don't know where he stood on a lot of that, but they just never really got reestablished. So pretty much my entire childhood, which was a wonderful childhood with 2 great parents, a great home, everything I could have ever needed, but it did not include church at all. The first time I ever came to church was to a Christmas Eve service here at St. Mary's in 1985 with my now wife, who I just started dating, had invited me to come to St. Mary's for Christmas Eve service. So that was the first time that I ever had been to a church at all. And it seemed a little strange to me, the kneeling, the standing, the hymns. It wasn't for beginners, I guess, but I could watch what everybody else did and go along with it. We continued to date for, 4 years of college at Chapel Hill. I continued for 3 years of law school at Chapel Hill. During all that time, church was not a part of my life, really. God was not really a part of my life on a daily basis. I think during that time, I kind of got involved in the things of the world, trying to get educated, a family, children, wealth, all the things that the world tells you are important. That's pretty much what I learned in college. Then I had another experience. So before my last year of law school, we became engaged. And one of the things we had to do is go sit down with the priest because we were going to get married here at St. Mary's. So that was something I was a little stressed about since it was Father Phil Craig. And I had to come in and talk to the priest and pretty much admit to him that I didn't belong to a church. And I'll really never forget what he said. I said, well, I don't belong. And I had kind of practiced the words I was going to use to say that. And he said, we're going to give you a place to belong. That was all he said. I mean, I thought, no judgment, no, we're just going to give you a place to belong. And it probably didn't mean anything to him, but it was important to me. So we were married here in 1992. I still wasn't really involved in church very much. We did attend, but it was kind of awkward for me because I was not baptized. I'd never even been baptized as a child. So when I would attend church after here, I wouldn't do communion. I wouldn't come up for the Eucharist because I was not baptized, which really wasn't that hard to get away with because we had little ones crawling around in the pews, and as some of you know now. So they were a distraction, but it was just kind of awkward. I didn't feel real connected to the church, not for a long time. Sometime probably in my early 30s. So that means more than half my life is passed at this point. I think I started to realize, I started to acquire all those things that the world told me were important. We had a big house. I was working for the largest law firm in town at that point. I had a new car, had one child, another one coming soon after that. We could take trips. We had money to do what we wanted, but I still didn't feel like I was, I just didn't feel like I was full and satisfied and complete. Even though I had all these things that the world told me this is what should make you happy. So I finally went back to the church and to God, and I said, well, now I need to look into this and see what's here. I think I always knew God was there. I just think I hadn't really taken the time to decide how he was going to be involved in my life. So I went to, I did the first thing you would think you would do if you had no experience with church, no Sunday school. You pick up the Bible and you start reading. And you probably get the King James Version because that's what's laying around, which is kind of hard to read. And you start at the first in Genesis and you start reading. And you give up when you get to about Leviticus and Numbers because you don't know who's talking about what or where this came from or who are the speakers or what's the context or when was this written. It was very difficult. It did not go well the first time I picked up and tried to read the Bible. But I didn't give up. I went back and I got a Bible handbook, which is more of a history and tells you about each chapter, where it came from, who the authors potentially are. And I started reading the Bible handbook first before I could read the Bible. And I also went back to my law school days and I started outlining what I was reading because that's what we always did to learn things in law school. You would make these extremely long outlines. And I think that probably took more than a year, just reading through, outlining the Bible. And I really came to kind of an understanding, and I started in the New Testament, which I recommend. But I started to understand who Jesus was and what he said and what the context of things were. And I really started believing, okay, this is a real person and this person really lived. And this person is who he said he was. And so I came to at least some understanding of that. And I I don't think it really changed everything at that point. It wasn't a great epiphany moment, but I was starting to become involved in church. I would put my first real turning point as the Alpha course. When we did the Alpha course here at St. Mary's for the first time, that's run by an Anglican priest named Nicky Gumbel. And Nicky was previously, before he became a priest, was a skeptic, a lawyer, and an anti-Christian, really, before he became a priest. And he presented things in a way that I really could relate to, just logically. He laid out the arguments. And there was one point in the Alpha course, and I'm a huge Alpha fan, and I'm so glad we were able to run it just before COVID kind of shut us all down. There was one point in the course where they put up a quote from C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis said that, and I wrote it down again here, Christianity is a statement which, if false, is of no importance, and if true, is of infinite importance. The one thing that it cannot be is moderately important. And the more I thought about that statement in the course of listening to the Alpha talks, I kind of realized that was what I was doing. God had become moderately important to me, but it was more on Sundays. It was not in my day-to-day life. And it's either false and of no consequence whatsoever, or it is true and it is the only thing really, or the most important thing that we need to understand. And so I think at that point, my mindset changed substantially about everything I did. And I started the biggest thing was kind of like decision making for me. So previous to that, I would make decisions based on how it affected me personally. How much money did it cost me? How much time did it cost me? Was it going to take me away from something that I wanted to do? Was it something that I wanted to do or felt, like I needed to do? And after that moment, I tried to look for those things that God was calling me to do. And I think that's what made all the difference. And I always looked at that point in my life, and I think that that's when a lot of doors started to open for me. I mean, I think my life got a lot better once I made that decision, not worse. I don't feel like I was taking on things that were like, okay, now I've got to go do all this service stuff and it's not going to be fun. Everything got better really for me at that point. And I think at the same time, and this is in the early 2000s, that I also started to realize that I was blessed with a lot of things. I was blessed with a lot of gifts from God that I used in my practice in counseling people, in representing people in court, in being able to just talk to people about certain things, really hard things that lawyers have to talk to people about. And there were things that made me successful as an attorney, but I also started to realize that God didn't give me those gifts just to make money for myself. And I was able to do that. I was very successful, but at the same time, that wasn't why I had these gifts. And in about 2008, my wife Laurie and I both read the book called The Hole in the Gospel by Richard Stearns. And that was probably the second turning point in my life, after the Alpha course. This was a book that really talked about the gospel and what it meant to serve others, especially in the third world, and people that were disadvantaged, and that if you took all those parts out of the Bible that talk about Jesus as a servant, and Jesus were concerned about the disadvantaged and the people that didn't have enough and the poor, and you just cut all those out, you wouldn't have much of a gospel. There wouldn't be really anything left. That is the heart of the gospel. And that motivated us. It motivated also a lot of other people in Kinston at the time, which was kind of strange because when it motivated us, there were a lot of friends who all said, hey, we've read this book too, and we want to do something. And we started outreach projects through the church. We started sponsoring children in Africa. We were sponsoring economic development areas in Africa. And it led us to, and I don't want to go into this a whole lot, but it led us into really having a passion for international mission work. And there's probably a whole nother story about how God guided us down the path to the Dominican Republic, to the little town of Mosavi that we go to. That there's a whole story about God directly intervening to bring us to Mosavi when our plans got changed the last week before we were going to go. But there is a whole story about that. But that has been a big part of our lives since then. We've been 7 or 8 times, depending on whether if you count the first one. And it's been a wonderful experience for us, but that was something that God called us to do, especially, through the book, The Hole in the Gospel, by Richard Stearns. He was the CEO of World Vision. I was also called during this time to serve on the Board of Education. I felt strongly that God wanted me to serve and advocate, at least use those attorney skills to advocate for public school children. I went there at a time when public school was really having a hard time with the way the laws were and the way the legislature and the different agencies involved were treating public education. And they needed an advocate. And I really felt like I was called there at that time to do that work. So at this point, I come to probably I've probably got 4 major turning points at least. So I'm coming to the 3rd major turning point. So, and this is a big one. This is probably the best example of how I feel like God has intervened and called me down a certain path. And it's not to ordination. It's not that I'm not there yet. So this is 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago this week, I should say. So this was March the 2nd of 2018. We're doing good. So March the 2nd of 2018, I went to, as a candidate, I think they're called, to Happening at the Trinity Center. Not because I really wanted to go, but my son Will was named the rector, which was kind of the head up front person. There's a lot of people that do a lot of work, but he was the head up front person for Happening in the diocese. So I was going to go that weekend just to support him, and I had never been, and I was the only one in my family who had not been. So I thought it was time for me to go. And at the time I was at Happening, it's a wonderful experience, but I also knew in my professional life that something wasn't really right, that I just wasn't satisfied with practicing law the way I had been. And I felt like something needed to change in my professional life. But I really didn't know what it was. And I didn't go to Happening to figure out the answer to that problem. I just knew that after 26 years of private practice, it just wasn't satisfying to me the way that it used to be. I didn't know what that change was at the time. I had thought about, if I could go to another career, but my skills I didn't think they were very transferable to another career. I didn't have any other place to go, so to speak. I couldn't make as much money as I could practicing law doing anything else that I could see. And I still had children in college. So, dropping everything and doing something else wasn't really on the table. But I wasn't really thinking about that problem when I was in Happening until I started hearing this song. And if you've been to Happening, there's about 10 songs they sing, and they do them over and over and over again. So you get to know every word of every song that you hear. So it was a song called Beautiful Things. And the first line of the song basically says, all this pain, I wonder if I'll ever find my way. I wonder if my life could really change at all. And then it goes on to say, God makes beautiful things. And as they played this song, I really felt like this was God speaking to me, that God could change this. It just seems, it just hit me at the time. And I really knew that. I said, this is kind of speaking to me about that God could really, because I didn't think it could change. I thought, well, I'm just going to have to deal with this, and I'll retire in another 15 or 20 years and it'll be fine, or things will get better. But that kind of made me think that God could change this. And so I prayed at happening that God would change my life, would make a change, do something, address this. But I had no idea where it was going to go, what was going to happen, what the path was. I didn't see any path forward at that point. So I leave after happening. That was on March the 2nd of 2018. On March the 15th, so 13 days later, I was sitting in a judge's chambers talking to another attorney who, this attorney, if God were to ever speak to me, he would speak through this attorney. Because this is an attorney who I think knows God well, said, just out of the blue, he said, I think you'd be a good judge. And I said, well, thank you, but why in the world would you say that to me right now? And he said, well, didn't you hear the chief judge has just resigned to go pursue, something else. And at the time I had prayed on March the 2nd, there was no position open to be a judge. All of our judges were well into their terms. It wasn't likely there was going to be any openings. But this was it right here. He resigned literally less than 2 weeks after I prayed that. And when the other attorney said that to me, I thought, is this it or is this not it? Is this what you're telling me to do? And luckily, about 2 days after that, I was back at Trinity Center for a conference 2 weeks later. And I went out to Sanders Point, which is one of the most incredible places if you've been out there at Trinity Center. And I really got the feeling that this was the answer to my prayer. And I followed through on that, talked to my partners, and they were supportive of it. I had been with them for 22 years at this point. We've been all in the same firm for 22 years. They were supportive of it. I started talking to the other attorneys. They were supportive of it. Talked to my family, and they were a little cautious, but supportive of it. And I felt like this is what God was calling me to do. And I also saw that as a judge, I could help so many more people than I could ever help as an attorney, because it wasn't based on who could pay me to help them. I could help every person that came in front of me. And they wouldn't have to, it wasn't just the ones who could pay me could be helped. And it wasn't always. I did a lot of things where nobody ever paid me, but and I saw that as consistent with what I was being called to do. And it all kind of lined up. And probably even more so than that. When I put in for that position, one of the things that happens is the lawyers vote over, there's like a bunch of candidates, the lawyers vote. And I'm thankful for that, but I got their support like 3-1 over the next person, which was just affirming to me that this is what I needed to be doing. I was also very lucky in that the governor at the time was of my same political party, because that would have killed it. And the governor was a huge fan, and our governor is a huge fan of public education. So he absolutely loves and supports public education, where I had spent the last 6 years immersed in public education. So it's this kind of thing of the stars aligning. So I was able to get that appointment. And so by July, I said this prayer in March, by July, I've closed my law firm, gotten rid of all my clients, and started practicing as a judge based on, and looking back, I just see God's hand in all of that, in where he's brought me through. And I was also blessed not to have any opposition in the last election, which is very unusual for a judge, which I consider that affirming too. So before I get to the last part, though, in the ordained ministry process, you spend a lot of time talking about what God's will is and whether this is God's will for you to do this. So I've started to try to, and maybe it's to help other people, to understand for me, what are the steps of discernment? What does it look like when God calls me to something? And you have to understand, this is the way it looks to me. It will probably look different to every person. And I think the first thing you have to do, if I was like trying to help people with discernment, the number one thing is to know yourself. Because if God's going to speak to you, he's going to speak to you in the way that you would receive it. So me, if you did the Myers-Briggs, I'm a sensing, thinking, judgment person, which means I'm going to look at, I got the STJ pretty hard, which is the opposite of an intuitive, feeling, perceiving person, which there are many of those. Actually, the STJs, a lot of them are in law, because they like procedure, they like structure. So I tried to go back through and look at these experiences and say, okay, what steps did I go through to make this, to hear these calls? What is there logic to this? Is there a structure to this? Is there something I can look for? And before I kind of walk you through that part, I just want to qualify it by saying it's probably not going to look the same for every person. It probably wouldn't look like for anybody, it could be different. God would speak to us all in very different ways. And I have to caution myself not to try to put God in a box, so to speak, and say, this is how God works and this is how he has to work, because it's not the situation at all. It's very open. But I can say for me that this is kind of the way it happens when I feel like God's called me. So number one, because this is my need for structure in everything. The number one is, generally I feel like there's something wrong, or there's something that needs to be addressed in my life. Either it's a relationship, which that doesn't happen, honey, or it's a church, or it could be work, it could be anything, activities, sports, could be anything. But generally I feel like there's something's not exactly right and there needs to be addressed. But I also believe that just because something's hard doesn't mean that that's not where you're supposed to be. When I went into the school board, it got really hard. But I didn't take that as a sign that that's not where I'm supposed to be. I took it as a sign that I was there for that hard time. So just because things get hard doesn't mean that that's not where God wants you to be. Sometimes you're there to deal with the hard things. And so yeah, I try to be careful. Not just because it's hard doesn't mean that that's not going right. But generally I will feel that something's not right. Something needs to be addressed. And then usually for me, a clear opportunity presents itself. Sometimes out of nowhere. And it's somebody brings that forward and says, this is what you need to do. There's that clear opportunity generally presents itself. And at that point, what I try to do is turn to prayer. I turn to scripture, listening, something that we all don't do enough of, but just listening to those people around us, those people we trust. And if it's really something I think God's calling me to do, then I'm going to get affirmations from that. Not always, but going to get affirmations from that, which is going to kind of tell me this is what I need to think of. Now, here's probably the most important thing for me in discernment, that if God is going to call you to do something, we're doing good. If God's going to call you to do something, he is going to give you a passion for that, whatever it is. That's the biggest thing that I've learned. So for years, I thought I would never want to go do third world mission work. But when the time came, God gave us a passion for that work. And when I say a passion, it's really just, it's strong, it's persistent. It's not, doesn't go, I mean, it's not there all the time. I don't get up every day thinking about third world mission work, and it doesn't really go away. It's a consistent calling that this is where God wants you to be. And you can run from it, you can try to hide from it, but it's going to keep following you. But that's probably the most important aspect of it that I've seen, is that God will give you a passion to do this. In general, it's going to be consistent with other things in your life. For me, it's always been, it's consistent. If I was called to be a judge and I was already involved in outreach and mission work, those two things were very consistent. It wasn't to a whole new area, although I'm sure it could be. But for me, it's always been consistent with where I've been and where I kind of am on the path. I'll also find that if it is really the right path, you're not going to find substantial, impossible roadblocks to doing it. He's not going to call me to be a judge and then give me a governor that would never appoint me because of my political party. There's going to be the road is, there's going to be, those avenues are going to be open for you. You're going to see that path start to open up. You may still hit roadblocks, and sometimes you still got to go through them. But for me, it's generally that path starts to open and become easier when I start down that path. And the last thing that I've recognized, at least in discernment, is that when you get there, when you start doing that thing that God calls you to do, you are going to get so much more out of it than you ever put into it. You're going to realize that satisfaction of doing what God calls you to do. And it's so much more that you get back than you put into it. There's no other way to describe it. It just satisfies you in a way that, other things can't. So that was kind of my feeble attempt to add some structure to maybe how God calls me to do things. But looking back over the times that he's called me in my life, I see that most of those things were there. I knew that something wasn't right. There was an opportunity. The doors opened when I did what God, I think, called me to do. I got affirmations, and I love my job now. And I honestly believe God changed my life when I asked him to, quickly. Now, I don't expect that in every case. I don't expect a 2-week turnaround time on prayer, but in that case, it's really what happened. There's just no other way that I can describe it. Now, I do want to leave some time for questions, but I guess I need to address the ordained ministry part. So there was a point, I guess, year before last, because in last year I spent almost the whole year in discernment. So it was toward the end of the year before, Father Tom and I had gone to talk to the bishop about the possibility of having deacons here at St. Mary's. I didn't know much about the diaconate, as it's called, the ministry of deacons. But I did start to read some about it so that when we went to talk to the bishop, that I would understand what we were talking about. And as I read more and more about the oath and the covenants for a deacon, that a deacon is the person who, as they say, brings the people to the church and brings the church to the people. So one of the major roles, and the major role of a deacon, is to bring the concerns of the community the disadvantaged, the disenfranchised, to the attention of the people of the church, and then to empower and motivate the people of the church to address those concerns. I read that, and then we went and talked to the bishop about that, and I just realized that's what I've been doing, and that's what I want to do. And I started to see the same signs. This is something that I think God's calling me to do. And in the last year, we've been through part of that process is you meet with your priest a number of times, talk about these same issues. And I guess that's probably why I can talk about them so easily, because I've had this discussion a few times. But you meet with your priest, and if he approves, then you do a local discernment committee, which we had a wonderful local discernment committee here with a wonderful leader who challenged me on a lot of things, but also affirmed me on a lot of things associated with this. And that goes on for weeks. And if you get past that point, you get to go meet with the Commission on Ministry for a full weekend of talking about your call. So I've been through all that, and now I'll be starting formation, which is about 2 years of learning classes in a process that's going to go on a number of years to hopefully become a deacon. But I see a lot of the same things, and I see all the same things that I've described to you before associated with this call. I really feel like that this is something God was calling me to do. And the one thing that kind of made sense for me, I'll just add this in at the end, that if I hadn't become a judge, I would have never been in a position to try to go into ordained ministry. Those two things are connected. In private practice, I don't know that I'd ever been able to do what I'm doing now. So I see the connection still goes back to this was how I got moved once, and then that made it possible for what I'm working on now. So it is a progression, but I don't really think it has an end to it. I don't think there's going to be a point where I'm going to say, I'm there. This is it. I've done everything God wanted me to do. I hope it keeps going, but I don't know. But so I'll probably finish about right there and open it up for questions, comments. And for the people online, I'll repeat, I guess, if somebody says something in the group. Any thoughts?
COVID has affected all of us in so many different ways. In your story, you had to wait.
Mm-hmm. True.
How did that help you discern? Did it cause you to question? How did that fit into the big picture?
Yeah, so the question is, so how did COVID affect this? Because we had actually started the discernment process here at St. Mary's before COVID. So we had had a couple of meetings without masks in the same room. And then COVID hit and we stopped the meetings. And I felt like at that time I needed to stop the meetings. There was too many other things going on in the world and everything was turned upside down. And I just didn't feel like it was the time to try to discern this kind of call while all that was going on. So actually we stopped meeting for a while. And actually it helped me because one of the reservations I had about becoming a deacon was, and it's a selfish reservation, I'll admit, but I'm getting to the point in my career where, I would retire before too long. And, there was a thought that when I retire, I've worked hard all these years. I want to not do so much. I want to take it easy. But I can tell you, like a couple of months of COVID and not working as much because the courts were closed, I am not made to stay home. I need to keep working. I need to be doing something. I can't just sit around and do nothing. That's just not me. It's not my personality, I guess. I certainly can do nothing sometimes, but I learned through COVID that I'm not the person to stay home. So once people got comfortable with it, we resumed and got through it. But it was kind of a distraction, but it did teach me that I want to be busy. I want to be doing these things for as long as God lets me do them. The questions? Yes, ma'am. Tira.
Did EFM play any kind of role in this process?
Well, and the question is, did EFM, Education for Ministry, play a role in the process? I think it did, because one of the things that EFM teaches you, what we do, if you're not familiar with Education for Ministry, I'll give you my plug right now. We look at different things, and it can be something from culture, it could be something from history, it could be something from the church, it could be scripture, and we delve into those things deeply. And one of the questions we always ask ourselves is, how do we apply this to our individual ministries? And just because it's called Education for Ministry, it's not to train you to be an ordained minister. It is to help you understand in your own life how to apply the things that God's telling you. So we do discernment every week, as I look at it, in Education for Ministry. And you can do discernment on anything. I did one on a water bottle the other night. We had an hour-long discussion about a water bottle, and it was great. If you don't believe it, you should come see it. But yeah, it certainly did. And those are, of course, the people I confide with about things I want to do. They knew probably before just about anybody else that I was thinking about doing this. So I want to say this too, because it just kind of came to mind, but that kind of a discernment process, and I know Greg knows since he's been through it, it's not a personal discernment. A lot of my other ones were kind of personal discernments. The ordained ministry is a community discernment. And it is so important that your community family supports you in that. It really needs to be a community decision to do that, not so much an individual decision. And I didn't understand the value of that before I started that process, but I understand it now that we've done it, that it's important to have that community support. All right, other questions? Got about 15 minutes.
John, you talked about like the Myers-Briggs and how people might hear the call of God based on what they're, based on who they are. And I loved your sort of scientific process. But for those of us who are the complete opposite of an ISTJ, I think it's interesting that you would talk a little bit more about how you would talk to other people about that process.
Yeah, and the question was that based on the personality of who you are, how might God, call you? Like I said, I had to look up to remember what the letters were. I knew what I was, but I don't look at it every day. I am an ISTJ. The opposite of that would be your extrovert person who's intuitive, feeling, and perceiving. Now, I'm definitely not that person, so it's harder to say, but I would think you're not going to see as much structure in it. It's probably going to be more of a feeling situation. Like I said, if for me to follow, I got to see that structure. I kind of got to feel that it's part of the plan. But I think somebody who had a different person might get a different feeling another way. And so when I was doing this, I really wanted to be careful not to say, this is how it happens. For me, this is how it happens. But for other people, it could happen completely different. It just might be that feeling that you get. If you're an intuitive person, you probably have a lot of insights that I don't have. So if you're, and I'm a strong J, and when it gets to that, if there was 20 questions on the perceiving versus judgment, I'm 19 J's, maybe one perceiving. Although it has changed over time. I'm more feeling and intuitive than I used to be, but I'm still not very feeling or intuitive. So yeah, I do think it can look different for different people. And I'm just trying to relate my experience as best I can. I hope it helps people. All right.
I want to say that I have seen your beautiful backyard that is a result of COVID, so you were busy. And I guess the thing about your mom, I know that she, before COVID, she was definitely here at church with all of you. So how has all of this been for her? Because you said you were really raised not in the church, and that she, I guess as long as I've known you, your mom has been here with you. Did that just sort of happen? Did she follow your lead, or?
She did. She did. I think for years she knew that we attended church as adults, and we would invite her to things as adults, and she generally wouldn't come to a lot. We invited her to things the kids were doing here at church, and she wouldn't come to a lot. But I think that was one of those things that kind of taught me, you pray for somebody, but you don't give up, because I think I prayed for her for a good 15 years before she made it here. So that wasn't a prayer that was answered quickly, but eventually it was. And I think she'd be here if it wasn't for COVID, even now. So yeah, I don't, as I said, she was raised in church, but I think it was when they had little children that they kind of got away from it. And I think maybe it was just easier for them. Like I said, but it wasn't anything intentional, anti-Christian or any. So it wasn't like a anti-Christian theology. We just didn't have any theology. It was just a blank slate, which in some ways I think helps me now. So I think I'm more open to see Christians as all being the same, because I didn't grow up in a specific denomination. So I get confused about denominations sometimes, like what are the different beliefs of different denominations? But I like to think it gave me a little more of a blank slate to figure things out. Strangely enough, so I have two brothers. We were all raised the same. And at least at one point, we were all three going to church. It all works. Yes, ma'am.
When you and Tom met with the bishop about bringing deacons to St. Mary, talk a little bit about that and what you hope that would accomplish for the church, and where are we? Are we moving along in that direction, or what do you still see the needs are for St. Mary's, and how might a deacon help, or have we sorted that problem in other ways?
That's a good question. At the time, we felt like we had a lot of energy in the church. We had kind of finished the Alpha course. There was a lot of activity. We had a lot of new people coming in, and we felt like we wanted to kind of keep that momentum going, is what Tom and I had discussed. And it was actually Tom's suggestion, maybe we can talk about getting a deacon. Of course, I think what we ultimately found out was, so deacons, while they are ordained ministers, they're not compensated. So they work pretty much for free. They keep their regular full-time jobs, and they generally are unpaid clergy, which appealed to me because it's not an issue for me. And because of that, they're only going to be available probably near where they live, because even while they work for the bishop is not going to say you've got to go to Wilmington to be at a church, because people, they're unpaid staff. You have to be realistic about that. So I think ultimately one thing they did end up doing was it kind of led toward hiring Liz in her position, because we did feel like we needed more help. But I clearly did not go down this path to fill a role at St. Mary's. That was not my intent, and I wasn't called to fill a role at St. Mary's. In fact, because of this, I will probably be taken to another church in about 2 years for a while, which will probably be the hardest part of this for me, would be not to be at St. Mary's for a while. But at some point I may return. Yeah, she probably won't go with me. But Greg understands that. He's from a church in Goldsboro, and he's doing his time here with us, not at his home church. So he certainly understands that too.
How long is that while? I mean, is it usually a year or more?
It's probably at least a year for someone in a diaconate position. Greg would be in a priest position, so that's different. But in a diaconate position, it's generally considered a year, and then you would become ordained. So generally you're looking at a year of discernment, 2 years of formation, and a year of interning, and then you might be ordained, if you get that far.
But the discernment carries through that whole time.
This, absolutely, the discernment carries through the whole time.
Change is coming as I understand it.
Mhm.
Every step is to enlighten it, to solidify and challenge. And so I would just say that although it seems to be regulated throughout that time, all things, new things could be made known, right? Is that what you?
Yeah, and just for the people online, Joe indicated that the discernment actually goes through the whole period. And I think it's as you're exposed to new things in formation and in interning and working, that's all part of the discernment process. So, discernment is life ongoing for your whole life. You're always going to be discerning what God's calling you to next. I don't think it's a period that ends at any point for any of us. You're always kind of looking around saying, okay, what is God calling me here or not? Yeah.
So 5 years from now, we could be calling you Father Sargeant.
It's possible. It's possible, God willing. And we'll just have to see. It's better to, and this goes with my personality. I'm a process person, so I'm just going to try to make the most of the process and see where it leads us. Because it's not to get to an end result. It's to be on the path that God wants you to be on. And we talked in my discernment about what if you do all this, you get to the end and they say, well, we're not going to ordain you. Or you say, I don't feel like I should be ordained. And that's fine, because this was a process that I think God wants me to go through. It's not about the end result. It's about the journey. It's about the path. All right, just a couple more minutes. Is that all we got?
No chat.
Okay, anybody online? Abby's still muted. She's not talking. She's nodding her head no. And she gave me a peace sign. Well, thank you for today. And I definitely enjoyed telling my Sunday morning story. So, all right.